Hey everybody, it is Monday, November 4th, 2024. Election Eve here at Mo News headquarters. You're listening to the Mo News podcast. I'm Mo Shwanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news, read between the lines, and try to keep track of this election in its final hours here. Jill, how are you doing?
Oh, cool as a cucumber over here, Moshe. How about you?
Jill, I like the front page headline of USA Today this weekend, the United States of Anxiety.
I love that. I put up a generic, how's everyone doing the other day just on my Instagram. And people were like, they assumed I was talking about the election. So that's number one. It shows you that people are really paying attention. And
that's
it's the only thing that
anyone is talking about.
Exactly.
Like, I'm on the bus, I'm walking around New York City, with family members who I never talk about politics with. And they're like, okay, so what's going to happen? What's going to happen?
Yeah. And everyone's like feeling very anxious, ready for this to be over. A lot of anxiety. It's a crazy time. We've been talking about this election now for well over a year. And it's basically here. It is here. 75 million people have already voted.
The election of 2016 never ended. The election of 2020 never ended. Like, we've been living this for 8 years, and then throw in COVID and the economic situation, a couple foreign wars. And it feels like it's constantly going. And of course, depending on the results tomorrow or whenever we know the results, the question will be, how much longer will this last? Will we have relative peace and certainty anytime soon? So as you listen to this, it's about 24 hours till polls open, depending on what time of day it is. As you listen to this podcast, polls open first thing Eastern time tomorrow morning. And Jill will get into the details, but we should note, pretty remarkably, 2/3 of Americans have already voted. Only about a third of Americans are waiting till Election Day based on the numbers right now. I made a point of early voting on Saturday. Took Olivia out to the Met, the museum, is actually my polling location on the Upper East Side.
That's kind of cool.
You get voting with a side of culture.
That is one of the cooler polling places. I just have to go to my high school, which is nothing. And
no famous works of art from ancient Greece at your high school.
No, they do have cool student artwork, which I always admire every time I go. I think they put it up just for Election Day, but I do enjoy it. And I can tell you, my parents have been trying to early vote here on Long Island, and the lines have just been so long because there's fewer polling places for early voting. So the lines, they said, have been insane. So they're just like, all right, I guess we'll just vote on Election Day at the elementary school. Moshe, you voted early. Like I said, I'll be waiting until tomorrow to vote on Election Day. And many states, including New York, early voting has ended today. So it finished up on Sunday. It is not in place on Monday, and polls open back up bright and early, or dark and early, tomorrow.
Yeah, it gives locations across the country a chance to reset things for Election Day.
Okay, let's get to the headlines. With 1 day until the presidential election, what the polls say is 77 million people have already voted. Live from New York, it's Kamala Harris. The vice president appears on SNL, but not everyone's happy about it.
Naturally.
Donald Trump on the campaign trail this weekend says he shouldn't have left office in 2020.
We'll have a recap of some of the more interesting remarks from the weekend from both sides.
Overseas, remember when we thought that Iran would not retaliate against Israel for Israel's counterstrike against Iran? Well, the country now says that it is planning a strong and complex attack on Israel, the U.S. message to Iran.
This would be the counterstrike to the counterstrike to the strike, at least in the latest back and forth.
What RFK Jr. says is one of his first priorities if Donald Trump wins the election, and it has to do with drinking water. A follow-up to those devastating floods in Spain, the Spanish royals visited one of the flood-ravaged areas, and they didn't get quite the warm welcome that they were expecting. 50,000 runners took to the streets of New York City this weekend for the New York City Marathon. The winners and which celebrities were part of the action. And Dawson's Creek's James Vanderbeek has been diagnosed with colorectal cancer, but he says he is optimistic. Plus, Moshe is on this day in history.
Jill will tell you about the boy pharaoh. There's your clue. If you're an Egyptologist, you know who I'm talking about.
I do recall a 77-part Instagram slide from your trip to Egypt, but I can't remember this.
Which pharaoh? There were many. We'll get to it at the end of today's podcast.
All right, to the news. The presidential race appears to be headed to a photo finish with the final set of polls by the New York Times and other media outlets finding the two candidates, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, neck and neck in the key battleground states. So in the Times poll, Harris is showing new strength in North Carolina and Georgia as former President Trump erases her lead in Pennsylvania and maintains his advantage in Arizona. In all 7 states, the margin is no more than 4 points and closer to 1 point in several, all falling, though, within the margin of error, meaning that the key states are up for grabs. The tightly contested landscape means that this race remains highly uncertain as the campaign enters its final hours. Harris is now narrowly ahead in Nevada, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, according to the polls, while Trump leads in Arizona. The polls show that they are locked in close races in Michigan, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Both candidates now have multiple pathways to getting to 270 electoral votes, depending on what combination of states that they win.
Jill, a top Democratic Congresswoman from Michigan, Debbie Dingell, a Democrat who tends to be very honest, used this term, and I think it probably describes many of you out there. She's obviously a Harris supporter as a Democrat. She was asked about how she feels Michigan is going to go. She described it as nauseously optimistic.
I like that instead of cautiously optimistic.
Nauseously optimistic. And I imagine there's a lot of you on both sides who feel the same way right now.
There are signs, though, that late deciders are breaking for Harris. So among the 8% of voters who said that they had only recently decided on their vote, she wins that group by 55% to 44%. And with Election Day just 1 day away, 11% of voters say that they are still undecided or persuadable. The polling comes as more than 77 million Americans have already voted. About 40% of the people who were surveyed by the Times Siena poll across the 7 states say that they have already voted. Notably, women have outpaced men in early voting turnout by nearly 10 percentage points, a trend the Harris campaign and Democrats see as reason for optimism. 53% of early voters nationally as of Friday have been women, 44% men. The margin is about the same as the 2020 election, when the gap at this same point in early voting also rounded to 53% to 44%. Democrats are bullish because women, who polls show back Harris over Donald Trump by a sizable margin, have maintained an edge in the early voting, even though Republican voters have formed a larger share of the early vote this year versus 2020. But Trump's campaign insists it is not concerned, arguing that the gap is simply the result of male Democratic voters so far staying home.
So, Jill, this gender turnout differential also applies in all the key battleground states. Right now in Pennsylvania, women have a 14% turnout advantage over men. In Michigan, a 10-point edge. In Wisconsin, an 8-point edge. In North Carolina, more women than men by 11 points. Georgia, 12 points. And then out in the Southwest, where Trump is more confident, one of the reasons he may be more confident, in Nevada, women and male turnout, 50-50. In Arizona, women have a 5-point advantage, both less than 2020. It's one of the reasons why Trump is feeling better there. Now, of course, we don't know how the women have voted. We don't know how the men have voted. We just know that more women than men are voting. And why does that make Democrats feel confident? Well, according to the latest polling, there's a 34-point gender gap right now. Right now, women are supporting Harris by a 16-point margin. 57% to 41% is how women are voting for Harris over Trump. Then flip it, men are supporting Trump by an 18-point advantage. So if more women than men are turning out and you have a slightly more of a margin from Trump with men, the hope among the Harris campaign is that with the female turnout, with more women than men voting, which is the historical normal thing that we've seen in recent elections, more women than men show up to vote, they feel good that if the numbers are running according to polls, that ultimately here, the women, they'll get enough of them in order to win. It would reinforce Harris's whole theory of the case and why she's really pushed reproductive rights and abortion here, especially in these final weeks. At the same time, though, Jill, that's what we know about the early voting. Again, we don't know how they voted. We just know the raw numbers here: 77 million Americans, more women than men in a number of the battleground states. We just don't know who showed up. There are internal Democratic numbers from a Democratic super PAC that have concerned folks internally. They do basically odds every week on whether Harris will win or not. Those odds dropped to 39% recently. Now they're back up to 49%. But as of a couple days ago, the Democratic super PAC was saying it's slightly more likely that Trump will win than Harris will win. Those are internal Democratic numbers there. These, again, are just numbers. These are just percentages, like percent chance. Basically, it's 50-50, right? There's a 50% chance we could win. There's a 50% chance. There's a 50% chance they could win, is effectively what the Democratic super PAC is telling the Harris campaign. And one caveat here on all these polls. This was sort of buried in the New York Times polling write-up. And I read here from the Times: across these final polls, white Democrats are 16% likelier to respond to our poll than white Republicans. That is a larger disparity than earlier polls this year. Not much better than our polls in 2020. It raises the possibility that the polls could underestimate Trump yet again. This is from the New York Times here. We do a lot to account for this, the New York Times says, but in the end, there are no guarantees. This is something I've heard from pollsters across the board, is that they continue to have a difficult time getting Trump supporters to answer their polls. So they have to weight things to try to account for it. Is that effective? Are they overweighting? Are they underweighting? Will be the question that will be answered on Wednesday morning.
Meanwhile, Kamala Harris made a quick surprise detour to New York City on Saturday night for an appearance on Saturday Night Live. She appeared alongside Maya Rudolph, who played her in 2019 and 2020 and came back again this year. The two were set up in a sketch with Maya as Kamala talking to herself in the mirror. And on the other side of the mirror was the real Kamala Harris. Not only do they sound alike, but they look so much alike.
It's actually uncanny to have seen them next to each other and see like how well like Maya portrays her. They're the same height, Jill. It was a remarkable thing to watch that sketch. Certainly went over very well with the very liberal Harris supporting crowd in the SNL studio. I think she got applause for about 30 seconds there before they could like continue the sketch. And Jill continues a tradition here of candidates appearing on SNL. Trump and Clinton both appeared back in 2015. Obama did. Sarah Palin did back in 2008. And it goes back to George H.W. Bush and Dana Carvey back in the 90s.
The appearance, though, did catch the attention of a Republican FCC commissioner. The Federal Communications Commission oversees broadcast networks. One of the GOP members of the FCC, Brendan Carr, called the sketch a violation of the equal time rule because it only allowed one campaign on. And he did point out that SNL creator Lorne Michaels recently told The Hollywood Reporter that he had not actually reached out to real life candidates and that he didn't plan to before the 2024 election. So this was an interview that he had done months ago. And Michaels said, quote, "You cannot bring the actual people who are running on because of election laws and the equal time provisions."
Yeah, so the way it works with the FCC is they have jurisdiction over the free over-the-air broadcast channels. You know, for those of us old enough to remember antennas, you can actually still get CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, the Fox network, not Fox News Channel, free over the air. And so the FCC has a whole bunch of regulations when it comes to equal time and rules and regulatory power. Remember, like the nip slip of Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake. They have jurisdiction over that because it was a Super Bowl on a broadcast network. Now, they don't have power over the cable channels or streaming channels or internet platforms, or frankly, every other platform that we use these days. But ultimately, NBC, one of the free over-the-air channels. The FCC has a 5-member board. Right now, it's 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Typically, it shifts based on who's president. Carr, who you mentioned, Brendan Carr, was appointed by Donald Trump as a commissioner several years ago during the Trump administration. He's set to be the chairman if Trump is elected. The FCC would then flip to a 3-2 Republican majority there. And it's unclear what sort of fine or punishment they would give NBC. Typically, these things are litigated for a while, and then the network pays some fine of a couple $1 million if they are found in violation, which, as you acknowledged, Lorne Michaels basically said, yeah, we can't do this because of the rules. And so sort of admitting in advance here. Nonetheless, the clips have gotten tens of millions of views, probably hundreds of millions by the time we wake up in the morning. And so that's that. The Trump campaign saying that she was cosplaying herself. They put out a statement saying, she's playing to Hollywood, etc. Even though, of course, Trump has appeared on SNL in the past. Jill, a couple things I want to note here as we close out this election segment. One thing we've been watching over the weekend is not just what the campaigns are saying. We're totally confident we're going to win, but where they're going over the course of the past few days. Harris has been pretty equally distributing herself around the 7 key battleground states. She ends today with a couple events in Pennsylvania. There are rumors of potentially big celebs being with her for the final event tonight. And then Donald Trump has moved his way around. He will end tonight in Michigan. But notably, Jill, in the last 3 days, he's done 4 events in North Carolina. He's been in North Carolina for at least an event every single day. Why is that interesting? North Carolina is a pretty red state. Now, while Obama won it once, it's been red here for more than a decade, and he sort of needs it in order to win. She does not need it. He needs it. And so they're not being public with whatever they're seeing, but clearly there's some data that the Trump campaign is looking at here potentially that has led them to, again, fly him into North Carolina 3 straight days to hold various rallies. And that, again, might be the early voting that they're seeing. That might be some polling that they're seeing. But that's pretty notable there. And then, Jill, we get to the viral moments of the weekend beyond the SNL appearance. While Kamala Harris herself, at least as of this recording late Sunday, avoided any major slip-ups on the campaign trail, it's the 2 older men that we've been following on the campaign trail who had some notable things that went viral on social media. First, Joe Biden. He was back on his own, not campaigning with Kamala Harris due to all the things we talked about last week and previous weeks and his 41% approval rating. He was in Pennsylvania, getting himself very worked up in a speech about Trump wanting to raise taxes for the rich, wanting to end Obamacare. And so this is what he had to say.
There's one more thing Trump and his Republican friends want to do. They want another giant tax cut for the wealthy. Now, I know some of you guys are tempted to think it's macho guy. I'll tell you what, man. When I was in Scranton, we used to have a little trouble going down the plot once in a while from Greenwich. But I'm serious. These are the kind of guys you like to smack in the ass.
So, Jill, you had Joe Biden talking about Trump and his team deserving a smack in the ass. Not to be outdone, Trump had a couple lines of his own that went viral. One that's sort of hard to do on the podcast because it's more visual than audio. Basically, his mic wasn't working very well in an event in Wisconsin on Friday night. He goes on a 3-minute rant about his microphone. At one point, he appears to simulate an X-rated act with the microphone. You can catch it online, on YouTube, on TikTok. It's everywhere. Anyway, they mimicked it on SNL. Pretty quick turnaround for them. Then on the campaign trail on Sunday, Trump says at one point that he doesn't think he should have left office in 2020. He sort of catches himself and then starts to talk about something else. And he's like, I should have stayed in office in 2020. Anyway, it sort of reinforces the worst fears Democrats have of Donald Trump, that he won't leave office. Again, the Trump team dismissing it, saying, don't pay attention to it. And then one more item in that same speech in Pennsylvania on Sunday. He talked about his assassination attempts, the various attempts on his life over the last couple months. He was talking about the bulletproof glass around him. Anyway, take a listen to this.
And I don't have a piece of glass there. And I have this piece of glass here. But all we have really over here is the fake news, right? And to get me, somebody would have to shoot through the fake news. And I don't mind that so much, because I don't mind.
So you hear him saying that the potential next assassin would need to shoot through the media there. The media immediately reacting, saying, is that a threat against us? They got to shoot through us. The campaign saying, no, that's not, you misinterpreted that. It's that he was simply observing things around him. There's no other interpretation you should have. He was actually looking out for the media's welfare, the campaign claims, despite the way he said it. And so anyway, it's just one of these things. There's some reporting over the weekend about how Trump has wanted more freedom to be himself over the weekend because he was very disciplined in the spring. And the summer, he felt that he was being constrained, he was being handcuffed, and so he wants to be able to say whatever comes to his mind. And that's what you've seen in recent weeks. And so you have some people around him who are very frustrated with Donald Trump, saying that this is his campaign to potentially win here. And by saying some of the things we just mentioned to you, he's really putting himself in a difficult position and potentially could lose the election, lose voters over some of the more extreme comments he's been making lately.
Yeah, Moshe, the quote about the media, about shooting through the media, it's like, okay, believe me or your lying eyes. You know, we all heard it.
Yeah, and we know he hates the media, and we know he threatens the media, and like he'll in his rallies he'll like make the crowd turn around and boo us. I've been to Trump rallies where like they do that, and like it's kind of crazy. It's like everyone turn around, like they're to blame for everything. And so anyway, again, people are going to be voting on issues, etc. But it's that stuff that I think he gets in his own way rhetorically. And that's something that don't hear it from me, hear it from people in his own campaign.
And while we're talking about the older men on the campaign trail making some snafus or misspeaking, I just wanted to mention,
or saying what they mean, Jill,
or saying
like, smack in the ass, like shoot through them, like maybe they're just saying what they think at age 78 and 81, respectively.
So we had told you about the comment that Biden had made where he was basically calling where he had basically called Trump supporters garbage. Okay. Yeah. So White House press officials actually altered the official transcript, and they changed where there would be an apostrophe in the word supporters. So that way it looked like he was referring to the rhetoric, or just maybe referring to the comedian instead of referring to the supporters themselves. And a lot of people have come out to say, you can't change the transcript. Like we're just in decades from now, when people look back on this election and when people want to read about what happened, you can't change the historical record. He said what he said. You could apologize for it, say that he misspoke, or whatever else you want to say. But changing the transcript, I mean, you're basically trying to rewrite history.
Yeah, it was the first time that I've seen the White House Stenographers Association have to push back on the White House.
Time for the speed read. Let's start overseas from the Wall Street Journal. Amid U.S. warnings against a counterattack on Israel, Iran is sending a defiant diplomatic message that it is planning a complex response involving even more powerful warheads and other weapons. This is according to Iranian and Arab officials briefed on the plans. It remains to be seen whether this threat is real or if it's just tough talk. Israel's punishing airstrike against Iran on October 26th shredded the country's strategic air defenses, leaving it badly exposed and sharply raising the risks to Iran if it actually follows through. So how the Israeli response plays out will depend on the size, nature, and effectiveness of Tehran's threatened strike. But Israeli officials have said that calculus could change if Iran strikes back. Iran has told Arab diplomats in the area that its conventional army would be involved because it had lost 4 soldiers and a civilian in Israel's attack.
Yeah, an Egyptian official nearby says that Iran has warned of a strong and complex response. So they say, the Iranian official saying that since they lost people, that they need to respond even more aggressively this time. Again, to your point, Jill, it's unclear whether this is rhetoric or not. One major factor here is the U.S. election. Right now, Iran does not want to impact the election. And in fact, if you listen to intel officials, it appears that Iran prefers Kamala Harris to Donald Trump, so they don't want to mess up her chances by basically starting a war in the final 24 hours here before the election. We shall see. But all bets are off after Tuesday here. The same thing for the Israelis. Internally, they're hoping for a Trump victory. Trump has effectively said publicly that he believes the Israelis should hit whatever they want inside Iran. Remember, it was Trump in his last year of his presidency who killed the top Iranian general, Soleimani, of the IRGC. So unclear what will happen next here. Again, whether this is Iran rhetoric because they feel they have to say this stuff, or whether they're actually going to do something. But this is sort of what we see in the region. Iran's telling the neighbors, we got to do something. Tell them we're going to do something. And we'll see what happens with all of it. But it does appear here, based on Western intel assessments, that Israel did some real damage to Iran in that strike, even though the Iranians won't admit it, hitting facilities that are going to take years to rebuild, equipment they depend on from the Chinese, from the Russians, both busy right now with other other matters. Unclear how long it'll take them. And Israel decimated their radar stations in Iran, basically leaving things open for a potential future Israeli strike.
From NBC News, Robert Kennedy Jr. said Saturday that a Trump administration would, on its first day, quote, advise all U.S. water systems to remove fluoride from public water. RFK Jr. is an advisor to the former president and has reportedly been promised a prominent role in the White House if Trump is elected. Kennedy says there are links between fluoride to various illnesses. However, several major medical associations and the CDC support some level of fluoride in the water, which they say is safe and is actually a benefit to public health and has significantly lowered the amount of cavities over the last 70 years. The U.S. is one of about 60 countries around the world that puts fluoride in drinking water. About 75% of the U.S. population on a community water source received fluoridated water as of 2020. Several states, though, have been looking at banning it. There have been no conclusive links to cancer, according to the American Cancer Society. The impact of fluoride consumption on pregnancy, arthritis, IQ, and kidney disease has also been studied. The results have been mixed, and scientists say more research is needed to be done to come to any strong conclusions.
At the same time here, you do see a move against this in several states, as you mentioned, and a federal judge in late September ordered the EPA to further regulate fluoride in drinking water because high levels could pose a risk of intellectual development in children. Again, very high levels. You'd have to consume a lot of tap water for that to happen here. Still, you have it being litigated here in the court system. And there are concerns with increasing research here about, while it's good to prevent cavities, the American Dental Association fully recommends it, that ultimately here there could be other effects and they want more study to happen. A little background here, the U.S. Has started to put fluoride in its water since 1945. It began in Michigan. The recommended levels over time have been lowered to address the potential for tooth damage and other risks. As you mentioned, about 200 million Americans currently have fluoride in their drinking water at the recommended level of 0.7 milligrams of fluoride per liter of water. And doctors and dentists will say that for every dollar spent on putting fluoride in water, that saves $38 in dental costs. But the U.S. practice does differ from Europe. We've talked about this with that Kellogg story a couple of weeks ago, that if there's any sign of risk, Europe cuts it out, whereas the U.S., we basically tolerate a higher level of risk. So in Europe, fluoridated drinking water is very rare, though we do share putting fluoride in the water with the Canadians, the Australians, and a number of other countries around the world. And so either way, look for a debate on this issue come January.
From Reuters, this story from Spain. A crowd of enraged flood survivors hurled clots of mud left by flooding at the Spanish royal couple on Sunday during their first visit to the epicenter of their nation's deadliest natural disaster in modern history. The barrage included a few rocks and other objects. 2 bodyguards were treated for injuries. Like many other countries in Europe, Spain still has a ceremonial royal family, though it doesn't have much of a practical day-to-day role in the country. Spanish fury has been unleashed against a state that appears overwhelmed and just simply unable to meet the needs of people that are used to living under an effective government. The disaster has killed at least 205 people in eastern Spain.
Yeah, we told you about this tragic flooding in recent weeks. Most of the anger has been fueled by the inability of the government to respond very quickly. Sort of reminds us of the Hurricane Helene situation in western North Carolina. Most of the cleanup of the layers of mud and debris has invaded countless homes, left a number of residents homeless, and most of it has had to be done by volunteers and not the government. A number of people still don't have drinking water after a number of days. Most people did get power back over the weekend, but stores and supermarkets are in ruins. And so when the royal couple came hoping to, shake some hands and show some comfort to people, they instead got mud in the face.
From NPR, Sunday's New York City Marathon saw first-time winners for both the men and women this year. Abdi Nagy, a 35-year-old from the Netherlands, claimed victory in the men's race on Sunday with a time of 2 hours, 7 minutes, and 39 seconds. It was his 4th appearance in the run and his first win in the event. He said after the race, at the finish, I was like, am I dreaming? I won New York. He did beat the 2022 champion Evans Chebet by 6 seconds. Moshe, my family and I were watching, and we were in the last 5 minutes or so, they were kind of like switching off who was in the lead. And we were like, who is it going to be? I felt like it was like the presidential race where we were like, it could go either way. And just awesome for both of them.
Jill, that's less than a 5-minute mile for the entirety of the marathon. Pretty incredible there. On the women's side, we had a first-time winner as well. In her marathon debut, Sheila Chepkuri, 33-year-old from Kenya, finished first in the women's race. She made it in 2 hours, 24 minutes, and 35 seconds. Her nearest opponent was the defending champion, Helen Obiri, who was 15 seconds behind her in that race. Americans finished in sixth place in both the men's and women's side, respectively. And we should note there are some notable celebrities who participated in the race this year. You had Randall Park from Fresh Off the Boat, Jennifer Connelly, most recently from Top Gun Maverick, and YouTube star Casey Neistat. It attracted an estimated 50,000 competitors from 150 countries this year. Jill, how many times did you run the marathon?
I've run the New York City Marathon 3 times, Moshe.
Did you run 5-minute miles the entire time?
No, I double that and then some.
Which, by the way, still amazing if you could do a 10-minute mile for the entire marathon. It's a while to think 26 miles, and these people are running it at the pace of a sprint.
And they make it look easy. It really is incredible. And I will say, as somebody who has run it 3 times, it is one of my favorite days in New York City, either as a runner, as a participant, or just as a viewer and cheering people on. There's such an energy and excitement and camaraderie through all of the 5 boroughs. It starts in Staten Island. You run across the Verrazano Bridge. You go to Brooklyn, Queens, into Manhattan, up to the Bronx, and then you finish in Central Park back in Manhattan again. And it's fun. It's great. It's such a great day. Congratulations
we went out,
to everyone who ran.
We went out to cheer the runners over on First Avenue on that final stretch there as they go back up through Manhattan into the Bronx and then around. So people were playing music out there, people passing around food, lemonade stands. It was awesome. And
there's always great signs. I saw one was like, you guys run better than the MTA, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, which runs the subway systems. And it's fun because you run and you see the signs and you laugh. All right. And now finally from People magazine, actor James Van Der Beek reveals that he has been diagnosed with colorectal cancer. The Dawson's Creek alum shared the news on Sunday. He told People magazine that despite the diagnosis, there is, quote, reason for optimism and that he's feeling good. He said he had been privately dealing with the diagnosis and has been taking steps to resolve it with the support of his incredible family. Van Der Beek is just 47 years old. He did not provide any other details about the diagnosis.
Yeah, wishing him a speedy recovery, but it does come as we've been hearing more and more about younger people, especially younger men, getting colon cancer. So definitely get checked out. I think right now they say at 45, they have a history of it. Like my family, for instance, you start at 40. Ideally, despite the diagnosis, he does continue to work. He's going to appear in a movie on Tubi coming out later this month. You, of course, remember him as Dawson Leary back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And he's the father of 6 children, Jill. And he shared photos on social media late last week of them celebrating Halloween. All right, now time for On This Day in History. We go back to 1922, 102 years ago today. British archaeologist Howard Carter discovers a step leading to the tomb of King Tut, the boy king, the boy pharaoh, in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. When he arrived in Egypt about 30 years earlier, most of the ancient Egyptian tombs had been discovered, or so he thought, though the little-known King Tut, who had died when he was just 18, was unaccounted for. Now, King Tut, we should mention, a pretty insignificant pharaoh historically. The reason why we all know him so well is because Carter would discover his tomb untouched. Most of the tombs of the pharaohs were basically, they stole everything from them. They were discovered by tomb robbers hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago in many cases. So when you go into these tombs, you could see the kind of beautiful artwork and tile, etc. in there. But everything had been stolen from them because they used to bury the pharaohs with all of their stuff, because the afterlife was what you were headed for, right? So we had your chariots in there, as we would discover from King Tut's tomb. The chariots, platters for food, cups to hold your drink. They would kill your servants because you need them in the afterlife. They would kill your pets because you need them in the afterlife. So they found all of that. in King Tut's tomb. So it really gave us a great perspective on this. Because again, King Tut as a boy king, you find out they write the history and hieroglyphics of that pharaoh inside the tomb. And so you discover, becomes the boy king. He dies at 18. Didn't really do much as a pharaoh. We just know him because everything was preserved. All right, we fast forward here to 1979. 66 Americans are taken hostage inside the embassy in Tehran. 52 of them would be held for 444 days. This is the famous Iran hostage crisis of the late 70s there. It followed the U.S. granting the deposed Shah asylum. This was the former leader of Iran in the U.S. The new government is part of the revolution, the Islamic regime there that we're still dealing with in the aforementioned story earlier in this podcast, then holds Americans in captivity for more than a year.
I think I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but if you are interested in what happened there, I highly recommend on Max. There's a multi-part series called Hostages about the 1979 hostage crisis, and it's fascinating. And they wound up interviewing then students who were involved in actually taking over the embassy. And it's fascinating. A lot of them have a lot of regrets about it, given how the situation in Iran has unfolded since.
And if you want the Hollywood version of it, Argo.
Exactly.
With Ben Affleck and John Goodman. And Jill, we end here with a bit of music history. On this day in 1997, she was one of the stars of the 90s, still performing today. Shania Twain releases her album, Come On Over, with Man, I Feel Like a Woman, You're Still the One, and that don't impress me much.
When albums still mattered, Moshe. A great album.
Good flow in that
I like
album.
the flow. All right, everybody, hang in there. We're almost there. We're almost at the finish line. Thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store, please.
And follow us for the latest and greatest over on Instagram. It's going to be a wild ride these next 2 days, folks. Buckle up.
I hope it's just 2 days, Moshe.
Let's pray.